We start this service as we sing hymn 526 in English, 315 in Yoruba, 526 in English, 315 in Yoruba. come. Let us sing a wondrous and wonderful love, tender and true, out of the heart of our Father above, streaming to me and to you, is wonderful love. Dwells in the heart of our Father who abides above. Dearly beloved, we gathered in the presence of God Almighty this Sunday to worship God, to bless Him, and to praise Him in the beauty of His holiness. I pray that God in His mercy will accept a heart of worship. In the name of God the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. This time around, the choir will be leading us in praise and worship.
Hallelujah. I will praise Him from everlasting, everlasting to everlasting. I will praise Him from everlasting, everlasting to everlasting. I will praise Him from everlasting, everlasting to everlasting. I will praise Him from everlasting, everlasting to everlasting. I will praise Him from everlasting, everlasting to everlasting. Oh, I will praise Him from everlasting, everlasting to everlasting. I will praise Him from everlasting, everlasting to everlasting. I will praise Him from everlasting, everlasting to everlasting. Jesus, I will praise You from everlasting, everlasting to everlasting. I will praise Him from everlasting, everlasting to everlasting. I will praise Him from everlasting, everlasting to everlasting. I will praise Him from everlasting, everlasting to everlasting. Thou art worthy, Thou art worthy, O Lord, to receive glory, honor, and power. For Thou art created all things are for Thy pleasure. And were created. Thou art worthy, Lord. Thou art worthy, O Lord. O Lord, to receive glory, honor, and power. For Thou art created all things are for the pleasure and were created. Olúwa yé bàbá gbọ́pẹ́ mi bá mo wà láàyè. Bàbá gbọ́pẹ́ mi nígbà tí mo sì lè jẹun, Olúwa, torí pé òkú mi kò lè yìn òkú mi kò lè yìn bàbá bàbá wá gbọ́pẹ́ mi o, bàbá gbọ́pẹ́ mi bá mo wà nígbà tí mo ṣì ń mí, bàbá gbọ́pẹ́ mi bá mo wà láàyè, torí pé òkú mi kò ó lẹ́yìn bàbá. Ẹ̀yin ni bàbá tó tó bàbá, ẹ̀yin ni bàbá tó ju bàbá lọ, ẹ̀yin ni bàbá tó tó bàbá, ẹ̀yin ni bàbá tó ju bàbá lọ. Ẹ̀yin ló lórí ayé tó jù lórí ayé gan lọ, ẹ̀yin ló lórí ọ̀run tó ju gbogbo ayé lọ. Ṣé mẹ́yìn ni bàbá Ọlọ́run àwọn ọlọ́run, ẹ̀yin ni bàbá, bàbá tó ju bàbá lọ, ẹ̀yin ni bàbá tó tó bàbá, ẹ̀yin ni bàbá tó ju. Torí látètè kan ṣe sẹ́ gbọ́ngàn ṣàlọ́rọ̀ ti wà o, látètè kan ṣe lẹ́yìn tí ń bẹ, ẹ̀yin náà ní bẹ̀rẹ̀ ohun gbogbo, àtòpin ohun gbogbo, alágbára ńláńlá lórílẹ̀ ayé. Ẹ̀yin ni bàbá tó tó bàbá, ẹ̀yin ni bàbá tó ju. Ẹ̀yin ni bàbá tó tó bàbá, ẹ̀yin ni bàbá tó ju bàbá lọ. Oh, what shall we do today? Today, oh, I will lift up my voice in prayer. What shall we do today? Today, oh, I will lift up my voice in prayer. For I know, oh, you are always there for me. Almighty God, you are my holy Lord. No matter what I face, when success come my way, I will tell you are Lord of the Lord, you are Lord of the Lord. Oh, to be praised and adored, you are Lord of the Lord. To be praised and adored, you be faithful Lord, you be faithful Lord. Oh, from the ages past, that is why your name, Olórúkọ ńlá is forevermore. Ta ló dàbí rẹ̀ Jésù, ta ló dàbí rẹ̀ o alágbára, ta ló dàbí rẹ̀ Jésù, ta ló dàbí rẹ̀ o alágbára. Ọba tó gbé ògo kárí ògo, láti inú ògo lọ sínú ògo. Ọba tí kìí sùn, ọba tí kìí rẹ̀, ta ló dàbí rẹ̀ o alágbára. Bí rẹ̀ ta ló dàbí rẹ̀ o alágbára. Bí rẹ̀ ta ló dàbí rẹ̀ o alágbára. Ọba tó gbé ògo kárí ògo, láti inú ògo lọ sínú ògo. Ọba tí kìí sùn, ọba tí kìí rẹ̀, ta ló dàbí rẹ̀ o alágbára. Hallelujah.
Worthy is the Lamb. Please let us pray. Father, in Jesus' name, Lord, in the mighty name of Jesus Christ, Almighty God, the one who was, who is, and who is to come, most glorious God, ever living God, the one that has been in existence before the whole wide world, the one that seated on the throne and nobody can dethrone, the one that will reign forever after this whole wide world might have come to an end. This morning we worship you. This morning we adore you. This morning we return all the praises back to you, O Lord. Father, accept our thanks in the mighty name of Jesus Christ for everything that you've done in our lives, for your grace, for your mercy, for your protection, for your provision, for your sustenance, for everything, Lord. We pray, O Lord, that you accept our praises in the mighty name of Jesus Christ. David said in his word, that if I harbor iniquity in my heart, that you, Lord, will not give ear to my supplication. Of everything that we may engage in, O Lord, of every way of our life, that we may cut short your glory. Lord, we ask in your infinite mercy this morning that you forgive us all our iniquity in the mighty name of Jesus Christ. The Spirit of the living God, we welcome you afresh. We pray, O Lord, that you take control of this service from the beginning even to the end. Lord, have your way today in the mighty name of Jesus Christ. We want to see your wonderful working power ends in our life, O Lord. We pray that this morning you stretch for that ends that is for signs and wonders. Lord, stretch it for today in the mighty name of Jesus Christ. King of the whole universe, we don't want to come into your presence and go the same. We want to go back home with the manifolds of your blessing. Lord, in this service today, oh Lord, Baba, bless us in the mighty name of Jesus Christ. Of every person that will take one part or the other in this service, we want you, oh Lord, to equip us with fresh unction, with fresh power, with fresh anointing. Lord, release on us this morning in the mighty name of Jesus Christ. Lord, after this service, oh Lord, we ask for grace to return all the praises back to you. Lord, we pray that you give to us in Jesus' name. Thank you, Lord, because of answered. We worship your holy name, for we prayed in Jesus' name. Amen. The Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from all evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Praise the Lord. We continue as to sing the hymn 504 in English, 504 in English, 312 in Yoruba. Testament reading is taken ẹ̀kọ́ kíkà látinú májẹ̀mú láéláé. Òun ni a mú nínú ìwé Exodus orí ìkẹrin. A ó bẹ̀rẹ̀ kíkà rẹ̀ láti ẹsẹ̀ ìkíní. Exodus chapter 4. The reading commences at verse 1. Hear the word of God. And Moses answered and said, But behold, do ye not believe me, nor hearken unto my voice? For they will say, The Lord has not appeared unto thee. And the Lord said unto him, What is that in thy hand? And he said, A rod. And he said, Cast it on the ground. And he cast it on the ground, and it became a serpent. And Moses fled from before it. And the Lord said unto Moses, Put forth thy hands, and take it by the tail, and put forth his hand, and caught it, and it became a rod in his hand. That they may believe that the Lord God of thy fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, hath appeared unto thee. And the Lord said furthermore unto him, Put now thy hand into thy bosom. And he put his hand into his bosom. And when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous as snow. And he said, Put thy hand into thy bosom again. And he put his hand into his bosom again, and plucked it out, and his bosom, and behold, it was torn again as his other flesh. And it came to pass, if they will not believe thee, neither hearken to thy voice of the first sign, they will believe the second voice as the sign. And it shall come to pass, if they will not believe also these two signs, neither hearken unto thy voice, that thou shalt take of the water of the river, and pour it upon the dry land, and the water which thou takest out of the river shall become blood upon the land. And Moses said unto the Lord, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither hitherto, none since thou art spoken unto thy servant. But I am slow of speech, and of a slow tongue. And the Lord said unto him, Who hath made man's mouth? Or who makes them dumb and deaf? Or the seeing, or the blind? Have not I the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with thy mouth, and teach thee what thou sayest say. And he said, O my Lord, send, I pray thee, by the hand of him whom thou wilt send. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, I not Aaron the Levite thy brother? I know that he can speak well, and also, behold, he cometh forth to meet thee. And when he seeks thee, he will be glad in his heart. And thou sayest, Speak unto me, and pour word in his mouth, and I will be with thy mouth, and with his mouth, and will teach you what ye shall say. And he said, and he shall be thy spokesman unto the people, and he shall be even if I be to thee instead of a mouth, and thou shalt be to me instead of God. And thou shalt take this rod in thy hand, with thee thou shalt go do the sign. This is the word of
his disciples. He left Judea and departed again to Galilee, near to the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Now Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being wearied with his journey, sat thus on the well, and it was about 6 hours. There cometh a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus said unto her, Give me to drink. For his disciples were gone away unto the city to buy meat. Then said the woman of Samaria unto him, How is it that thou, being a Jew, askest drink of me, which I am of a Samaritan? For the Jews have nothing dealing with the Samaritans. Jesus answered and said unto her, If thou knowest the gift, and who is it that said unto thee, Give me to drink, thou wouldest have asked of him, and would have given thee a living water. The woman said unto him, Say, thou have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. From whence and thou hast thou a living water? Art thou greater than our father Jacob, which gave us the well, and drink therefore himself and his children and his cattle? Jesus answered and said unto her, Whosoever drink of this water shall thirst again. But whosoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst. But the water that I shall give him shall be in him a well of water springing up unto everlasting life. This is the gospel of Christ. The hymn 525 in English, Yoruba 313. The hymn 525 in English, Yoruba 313. English 528. English 528.
Give me
King of kings, Lord of lords, we give glory, we give adoration to you for making it possible for us to see a new day.
Thank you, Jesus.
A new Sunday in which you will shower your blessings of rain upon each and every one of us. Lord, we give glory to you. Lord, we praise you. The entire world have seen that without your word, the world cannot survive. Therefore, Lord, at this juncture, we are going to preach your word. Lord, let your word, let it transform each and every one of us.
Amen.
Thank you, wonderful Jesus.
Thank you, Jesus.
In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen.
We have to thank God for making it possible for us to see another day.
A ní láti dúpẹ́ lọ́wọ́ Ọlọ́run fún àǹfààní ńlá tó fún wa láti rí àyájọ́ ọjọ́ ìsinmi mìíràn.
We have to thank the head of the diocese,
A ní láti dúpẹ́ lọ́wọ́ bíṣọ̀bù dáúsìsì yìí.
in which he has actually stood by the church,
Ẹni tó jẹ́ wípé lótìtọ́ àti lódodo ó dúró ti ìjọ.
stood by the congregation,
Lótìtọ́ àti lódodo ó dúró ti àwọn ènìyàn nínú ìjọ.
praying for the church of God,
Tí wọ́n sì ń gbàdúrà
that the entire church of the world will come out of this pandemic.
wípé gbogbo ìjọ lágbàáyé wọn ó jáde kúrò nínú hílà ìlò yìí.
The Lord will be with you, sir.
Olúwa yóò wà pẹ̀lú yín.
The Lord will protect you.
Ọlọ́run nínú àánú rẹ̀ yóò máa sọ.
And he said, a rod.
Olúwa sì wí fún un pé kí ni ó wà ní ọwọ́ rẹ ni? Òun sì wí pé ọ̀pá ni.
The love of God with man
Ìfẹ́ Ọlọ́run sí ènìyàn
made man to have an encounter with God.
ó jẹ́ kí ènìyàn kó rí ìrírí pẹ̀lú Ọlọ́run.
Moses had an encounter with the Lord
Mósè ní ìrírí pẹ̀lú Ọlọ́run
when he was not expected.
nígbà tí kò tiẹ̀ rò rárá.
But Moses deliberately refused the instruction of God.
Mósè nínú ọkàn rẹ̀ ó kọ̀ láti tẹ̀lé àṣẹ tí Ọlọ́run pa.
Despite the fact that God showed him signs and wonders.
Bó tilẹ̀ jẹ́ pé Ọlọ́run fi iṣẹ́ àmì tó dájú hàn.
1. Turning the staff of office to snake.
Ní àkọ́kọ́ ó sọ ọ̀pá ọwọ́ rẹ̀ di ejò.
2. Making Moses to be affected with leprosy.
Ní ẹ̀kejì ó sì tún mú kí ọwọ́ rẹ̀ kó dẹ́tẹ̀.
Moses never believed in God.
Fún ìdí Mósè kò tí ì ní ìgbàgbọ́ nínú Ọlọ́run.
When we look at Exodus chapter 4 verse 10.
Nígbà tí a bá wo orí ìkẹrin bí tá a kà ẹsẹ̀ ìkẹwàá.
With all what God said,
A gbọ́ ohun tí Ọlọ́run sọ.
Moses gave flimsy excuses.
Mósè bẹ̀rẹ̀ sí ní ṣe àwáwí lóríṣiríṣi.
Oh God, I am not fluent.
Ọlọ́run èmi ò mà mọ̀rọ̀ sọ.
God, I cannot speak with Pharaoh.
Mi ò ní ìgboyà láti dojúkọ Fáráò láti sọ̀rọ̀.
You know, when we are speaking Egyptian language,
Nígbà tí a bá ń sọ ọ̀rọ̀ ti àwọn ará Íjíbítì.
Pharaoh has the diction better than I do.
Fáráò ó mọ èdè yìí dáadáa jù mí lọ.
Moses said, God, aren't you aware that I am a man of a big tongue?
Ṣé o tiẹ̀ ti gbàgbé ni pé ahọ́n mi lọ̀?
It was at that moment that God said, look, Moses, forget all what you are saying.
Ní ìkórìtà yìí ni Ọlọ́run sọ fún Mósè yìí pé gbàgbé gbogbo èyí tí ò ń sọ yìí.
I have sent Aaron to come and meet you, your senior brother.
Mo ti rán Árónì sí ọ láti wá pàdé rẹ.
People of God.
Ará nínú Olúwa.
And my brethren looking at us.
Àti gbogbo àwọn ènìyàn tí wọ́n ń wò wá.
One thing that man have forgotten.
Ohun tó jẹ́ pé a ò ní láti gbàgbé.
God have endowed each person.
Òun ni wípé Ọlọ́run fúnra rẹ̀ ó ti bùkún ẹnì kọ̀ọ̀kan.
God have endowed each and every one of us what you strongly believe that you are lacking.
ohun tí a rò yí pé a ò ní ní Ọlọ́run ti fi sí wọn ní ìṣẹ́gun nípa ohun tí ó wà ní ọwọ́ wọn.
You are the next to succeed.
Ìwọ náà ni ẹni tí àṣeyọrí kan o.
They succeeded by what was in their hand.
Àní wọ́n ṣe àṣeyọrí nípa ohun tí ó wà ní àtẹ́lẹwọ́ wọn.
Without any biased mind, everybody is aware of what is crisis in which the entire world is facing.
Láìsí àní-àní, mo lérò wípé gbogbo wa la rí àdójúkọ tí gbogbo àgbáyé ń dojúkọ ní wákàtí yìí.
Therefore, I want you to stretch your hands, those who are looking at me at home.
Gbogbo àwa tí à ń wò wá látinú ilé, a fẹ́ kí a na ọwọ́ wa pẹ̀lú.
You and your family, you are going to make it in Jesus' name.
Ìwọ àti ẹbí rẹ ẹ ó lu àlùyọ lórúkọ Jésù.
Either COVID-19 or no COVID-19.
Yálà àìsàn yìí wà o tàbí kò tiẹ̀ sí.
No virus will affect you.
Kò sí ìdojúkọ àìsàn kankan tí yóò yọ ọ́ lẹ́nu.
Your vision for 2020
Èrèdí rẹ fún ọdún tí a wà nínú rẹ̀ yìí.
will not be derailed in Jesus' name.
Lórúkọ Jésù kò mà ní já sásán.
You will progress each day.
Wàá máa lọ síwájú
You will
lójoojúmọ́ ni.
progress in life.
Wàá máa tẹ̀síwájú nínú ayé.
2020
Nínú ọdún yìí
will be a wonderful year for you.
yóò jẹ́ ọdún tó làmìlaka fún ọ.
They succeeded by what was in their hands.
Wọ́n ṣe àṣeyọrí nípa ohun tí ó wà ní ọwọ́ wọn.
Let us look at the book of Matthew 14,
Ẹ jẹ́ ká wo ìyìnrere ti Matthew orí ìkẹrìnlá
17 to 20.
ẹsẹ̀ ìkẹtàdínlógún sí ìkejìdínlógún.
The feeding of 5,000 people.
Bíbọ́ àwọn ẹgbẹ̀rún márùn-ún ènìyàn.
The congregation were worried.
Àwọn ènìyàn yìí wọ́n wà nínú ìpòrúurú ọkàn, ṣùgbọ́n ohun tó wà ní ọwọ́ wọn òun ni wọ́n lò ní irú àkókò yìí.
The feeding of 5,000 people. Young boy.
Èyí tó wà ní ọwọ́ ọ̀dọ́mọkùnrin kékeré kan.
Jesus took the bread.
Jésù Kristi mú àkàrà yìí,
Look at heaven.
ó sì bójú wo òkè ọ̀run.
Said to the Father,
Ó sì wí fún Ọlọ́run pé
only 5 loaves of bread
wípé ẹ yọ ìṣù àkàrà márùn-ún yìí péré
and 2 fish.
àti ẹja wẹ́wẹ́ méjì.
And he convicted it.
Ó sì gbàdúrà sí i.
The 5,000 people ate it,
Ẹgbẹ̀rún ènìyàn yìí wọ́n jẹ,
and there was a surplus of 12 bags.
a sì tún rí àjẹkù agbọ̀n 12.
They succeeded
Wọ́n ní àṣeyọrí
by what was in their hand.
nípa ohun tó wà ní ọwọ́
Jesus
wọn.
succeeded
Jésù Kristi ní
by
àṣeyọrí
what was in his hand.
nípa ohun tó wà ní ọwọ́ rẹ̀.
What the Lord is telling each and every one of us,
Ohun tí Ọlọ́run sọ fún ẹnìkọ̀ọ̀kan wa lónìí ni pé
that whatever situation we are facing,
wípé onírúurú ipòkípò tí a lè wà,
make good use of what you have.
ẹ jẹ́ ká lo àǹfààní ipò yìí, ohun tí a bá ní.
Make good use of what you have.
Ẹ jẹ́ ká lo àǹfààní ohun tí ó wà ní ọwọ́ wa.
They succeeded.
Àní wọ́n ṣe àṣeyọrí sínú ìtàn ìgbésí ayé ọ̀dọ́mọkùnrin
There was
yìí.
a young boy
Ọ̀dọ́mọkùnrin kan wà
who worked in his own environment.
tó ń ṣiṣẹ́ ní agbègbè rẹ̀.
The young boy opened a shop,
Ọ̀dọ́mọkùnrin yìí ó ṣí ilé ìtajà kan,
and he was a clerk.
ó sì jẹ́ agbowó nínú ilé ìtajà yìí.
He failed woefully.
Ó ní ìjákulẹ̀ púpọ̀ gan,
He ran into bankruptcy.
tó jẹ́ wípé ìdókòwò rẹ̀ jákulẹ̀.
He opened another shop.
Ó tún ṣí ilé ìtajà mìíràn,
He failed.
ó tún bá ìjákulẹ̀ pàdé.
He ran as a legislator.
Ó gbé igbá ìdíje gẹ́gẹ́ bí aṣojú aṣòfin,
He failed woefully.
ó tún ní ìjákulẹ̀.
He contested for the post of vice president.
Ó tún gbé ìdíje gẹ́gẹ́ bí igbákejì ààrẹ orílẹ̀-èdè.
He was disappointed.
Síbẹ̀síbẹ̀ ìjákulẹ̀ ló bá pàdé.
That person later on became the 16th American president.
Ní ẹ̀yìn òrẹ́yìn, ọ̀dọ́mọkùnrin tí a sọ yìí wá jẹ́ ààrẹ orílẹ̀-èdè Amẹ́ríkà ìkẹrìndínlógún.
His name,
Orúkọ rẹ̀ ní
Abraham Lincoln.
Abraham Lincoln.
Of all the presidents that have reigned in America,
Nínú gbogbo àwọn ààrẹ tó ti jẹ nílẹ̀ aláwọ̀ funfun,
Abraham Lincoln is regarded as the poorest president ever had.
Abraham Lincoln ó jẹ́ ààrẹ tí kò ní nǹkan kan tó àwọn ààrẹ tó ti jẹ àti tó tún jẹ lẹ́yìn rẹ̀.
But when you are talking of the best presidents,
Ṣùgbọ́n nígbà tí a bá ń sọ èyí tó lu àlùyọ jùlọ,
Abraham Lincoln is one of the best American presidents ever
Abraham
had.
Lincoln yìí ó jẹ́ ọ̀kan nínú àwọn tó lu àlùyọ jùlọ.
People of God,
ará nínú Olúwa.
at this point in time, I'm calling each and every one of
Nírú
us.
àkókò yìí mo máa ń pe ẹnìkọ̀ọ̀kan wà.
There must be, you may have setback,
Ó lè ní ìjákulẹ̀ tàbí ìfàsẹ́yìn,
that you will succeed.
ṣùgbọ́n lórúkọ Jésù wàá lo àlùyọ.
What you need to succeed is deposited in your heart.
Ohun tí ó lò láti ṣe àṣeyọrí náà Ọlọ́run ti fi fún ọ.
All you need to shine is on this planet Earth.
Ohun tó o nílò gẹ́gẹ́ bí ẹ̀rí ó wà ní ilẹ̀ àgbáyé yìí.
When you work,
Nígbà tí o bá ṣiṣẹ́,
you will progress.
ó sì tẹ̀síwájú.
I would like all of us, when we go home,
Mo fẹ́ gbogbo wa nígbà tí a bá dénú ilé,
when we look at the book of Genesis,
nígbà tí a bá wo ìwé Jẹ́nẹ́sísì,
as God asked questions, so also Moses asked questions.
bí Ọlọ́run ti béèrè ìbéèrè, bákan náà gẹ́lẹ́ ni Mósè ti béèrè ìbéèrè.
My God said, "Where are you, Adam?
Ọlọ́run béèrè wípé níbo ni ìwọ wà Ádámù?
Where are you naked?
Kí ló dé tí o wà ní ìhòhò?
What is your name?
Kí ni orúkọ rẹ?
What is in your hand?"
Kí ni ó wà lọ́wọ́ rẹ?
When we want to succeed in the year 2020,
Nígbà tí a bá fẹ́ lu àlùyọ nínú ọdún tí a wà yìí,
when we get back to our closet,
nígbà tí a bá wá dé inú kọ̀rọ̀ yàrá wa,
we should ask questions,
a ní láti béèrè ìbéèrè.
and God will give us answer.
Ọlọ́run fúnra rẹ̀ yóò sì wá fi ìdáhùn sí i.
People of God,
Ará nínú Olúwa.
2020 in this pandemic,
Nínú ọdún tí a wà yìí, bó tilẹ̀ jẹ́ wípé àrùn gbogbo nínú rẹ̀,
you will not fail in Jesus' name.
o ò ní bá ìjákulẹ̀ pàdé
You
lórúkọ
will
Jésù.
succeed in Jesus' name.
Wàá lu àlùyọ lórúkọ Jésù.
Absolute protection of God will be with you.
Ààbò Ọlọ́run yóò wà lórí rẹ̀.
God bless you all.
Ọlọ́run yóò wà pẹ̀lú yín.
Let us pray. Father, in the name of Jesus.
Amen.
Lord, in the mighty name of Jesus.
Amen.
Once again, we want to appreciate you for what you have done, what you are doing right now, and what you are going to do. We thank you for the shower of blessings today. We thank you for your protection, your provision, your loving kindness towards us. Be thou exalted in the mighty name of Jesus.
Amen.
Lord, we thank you even for this period that we are passing through, because we know that you are the fourth person in the furnace of what we are passing through.
Yes.
You are with us. You are behind us. You are not going to leave us alone. And so, Lord, we thank you for what you are doing right now, because soon as you will bring this virus to an end in all the world in the mighty name of Jesus.
Amen.
Father, we commit those people who are sick right now, either because of COVID-19 or other sickness. You are the healer. Father, we call on you that you lay your healing hand upon them in the mighty name of Jesus.
Amen.
Ohunkóhun tó ń yọ wọ́n lẹ́nu nínú ẹ̀jẹ̀, nínú omi ara, nínú egungun, nínú iṣan, nínú ẹ̀dọ̀fóló, a fẹ́ kó o na ọwọ́ rẹ jáde lákòókò yìí, ọwọ́ ìwòsàn, ọwọ́ ìmúláradá lórúkọ Jésù, Olúwa nà án sínú ayé wọn.
Amen.
Father, we pray for our government, from the federal down to the local government. Father, we pray that you lead them aright to do what is right at this time in the mighty name of Jesus.
Amen.
You will guide them aright. You will lead them aright.
Amen.
You will meet them even at the point of their discussion and guide them right for the purpose of people under them in the mighty name of Jesus.
Amen.
Lord, we pray for this new week. You are the Alpha and Omega,
Yes, Lord.
the beginning and the end.
Yes.
Without you, we can do nothing.
Yes.
Lord, we commit ourselves now that we are going out, we are mixing together, we are buying, we are selling. Lord, we plead the blood of Jesus Christ upon our nation at this time, that you will cure us, you will cover us with your blood in the mighty name of Jesus.
Amen.
Ohunkóhun tí àwọn ènìyàn ń fẹ́
tí wọ́n ń jáde tí wọ́n ń wọlé lákòókò yìí Olódùmarè ó léwu ju ti ìgbà tí a wà nínú ilé lọ ṣùgbọ́n ohun tí a béèrè fún ó ní ẹ̀jẹ̀ rẹ Olódùmarè, ẹ̀jẹ̀ tó ń sàn fún ìwòsàn, ẹ̀jẹ̀ tó ń sàn fún ìmúláradá lórúkọ Bàbá Ọmọ àti Ẹ̀mí Mọ́. Ẹ̀jẹ̀ rẹ Olúwa fi bò wá lórílẹ̀‐èdè yìí. Ẹ̀jẹ̀ rẹ Olúwa fi bò gbogbo àgbáyé. Ohunkóhun tó ń fa àìsàn yìí lórúkọ Jésù Bàbá bá wa gba agbára lọ́wọ́ rẹ̀. Ògo ni fún orúkọ rẹ̀.
Hallelujah.
Lẹ́ẹ̀kan sí Ọlọ́run ìyanu, a gbàdúrà fún àwọn oníṣègùn wa, the doctors, medical personnel, both doctors and nurses that are doing all these things. Lord, we pray that you cover each and every one of them with your blood in the mighty name of Jesus.
Amen.
No virus, no sickness, no anything that is evil we enter their body at this time in the mighty name of Jesus.
Amen.
As we go in this new week, Lord, go with us.
Amen.
Go before us.
Amen.
Go behind us.
Amen.
Father, protect us.
Amen.
Lord, meet us at the point of our need in the mighty name of Jesus.
Amen.
And when this week shall come to an end, Lord, fill our mouth with testimonies.
Amen.
In the mighty name of Jesus.
Amen.
Thank you, Father.
Thank you, Lord.
Thank you, Jesus.
Thank you, Jesus.
For we pray with thanksgiving in Jesus' name.
Amen. 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 In Jesus' name. Thank you for the price you paid. Buried all my sins and shame in all you came and gave amazing grace. Thank you for the blood, Lord. Thank you for the medicine. Wash me in your cleansing flow. Now that I know your forgiveness and embrace. What is the Lamb seated on the throne, crying away many crowns, you reign victorious. I am lifted up, Jesus, Son of God, Lord of heaven, crucified. Worthy is the Lamb. Worthy is the Lamb.
And the blessing of God Almighty,
Amen.
the Father,
Amen.
the Son,
Amen.
and the Holy Spirit
Amen.
be with us in this nation.
Amen.
Be with us in all the world.
Amen.
Guide us and heal us from all our sicknesses.
Amen.
And make our life a testimony to our people.
Amen.
In the name of God the Father,
Amen.
God the Son,
Amen.
and God the Holy Spirit.
Amen.